For the past 3 weeks, we have been discussing anti-Black systemic racism within a Canadian context. And before we begin this third and final installment, I'd like to thank the panelists for lending their time to this discussion. Ucha, who is an executive director in the nonprofit sector, Andrew, senior manager, Tazio, a manager in social work, and Nicole, a high school teacher and a system curriculum leader. But our devotion to social reform extends beyond titles. Through our lived experiences and vocation, we have tried to show the profound impact systemic racism continues to have on the Black community, not just in relation to police violence, but in education, food security, mental health, and criminal justice. Today, we're focusing on recommendations and moving forward as allies. My guests will share their thoughts for the next 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll ask you, those watching live, for questions which can be posted in the comments section. Thanks for watching. Tazio, I'd love to start with you and your recommendations and personal reflections.
Thanks, Derek. I think both for the listener and the speakers, we've been anxiously waiting to get to this day in terms of recommendations. And I want to just thank everyone that's been with us over the past 3 weeks. Before I put forth my recommendation, I just want to kind of position our thinking, and I want to speak real briefly on a terminology they call the bystander effect. It's a social psychological theory, and I'm just going to give you just real quick what that means. It means that when there's a group of people looking at some form of injustice or some form of harm, they call it the diffusion of responsibility, where there's less likely that anyone will take responsibility for what's been taking place. So they've done research and show, for example, there's one incident where a group of individuals actually watched a woman get abused in some very graphic term, and everyone watched it and no one took place, and they kept on seeing this throughout society, is that the larger the group of people watching an incident, the less likely someone's going to actually take responsibility, because everyone's using responsibility to the other person that's standing in that vicinity. And I think for us, when we come to recommendation, one of the things we want to do is overcome that bystander effect, where everyone looks to the other person to fix the problem, the racism, and everyone collectively take responsibility in terms of what they can do to move this cause forward, as opposed to pointing the finger saying, okay, this person beside me, they could take it. So with that being said, I want to just propose a couple of recommendations. First and foremost, and this might be the strongest one, is that when you, and I'm going to probably speak to those who want to be allies, that when you want to support a cause, one of the things that you want to be mindful, you never fight on behalf of the group or the individual, fight with the group or the individual. And I'll just give you a quick example.
Sorry, Tazio, to interrupt. I'm enjoying what you're saying. For some reason, we're having a bit of problem with your microphone.
Let me come closer. How do I stand now?
Yeah, that sounds better. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'll repeat what I just said. So as one of the recommendations that we should do, always remember this principle. Never fight for somebody or group of people or individual that is facing injustice. Always fight with. What I mean by that is that when you fight for, number one, you destroy their voice. And then secondly, you might do things that you think is good in the interim, but could be harmful in the long term. I'll give you a quick example. When I was working with a young man in the justice field, I remember I used to go and they're in this racist facility, and I used to go and I used to fight for them real hard. And when a young man says, hey, Taz, you know what happens? When you come and fight so hard and you leave, guess what happens? They take it out on us. And there's the pain's more. So then I have to sit down with them and say, okay, how could I fight with you? You're in it. I get to leave and go back home to my place of safety, but you're in it. I'm fighting on behalf of yours. So how do I fight on your behalf and take into consideration what might happen to you when I leave? And I began to sit down with these young men, and we began to problem solve together, as opposed to me saying I'm going to be the hero and fight on their behalf. I fought with them because there's some insight in terms of what are some of the experiences they face after I leave. And as an ally, you got to understand that racism ain't going to disappear tomorrow. So you want to sit down with Black individuals and say, listen, how can I best support you? How could I make sure that when we're advocating, your voice is not lost and what you want to see take place is not lost? It can't be about us. So that's one of the first recommendations, probably one of the strongest one I would probably put forth. And then I'll give another one. There's many panels on the line, so I'm pretty sure a lot more is going to come through. But the second one is being willing to be courageous and have courageous conversation. And what do I mean by that? Courageous conversation don't mean that, okay, I just want to acknowledge racism. It means that in your sphere of influence, wherever that might be, your work, your family, is having the courage to have the conversation about racism and having the courage to begin to propose things that will solve it. And I'm saying having the courage because this is the first time that society has overcome the bystander effect. This is the first time where society has looked at injustice and has not diffused the responsibility to specifically to the Black community. This is the first time I've seen where the society in a bigger scale saying, okay, injustice, racism is wrong, and everyone begin to take responsibility for it. And what are the recommendations says in your workplace, don't allow the conversation to die down, because right now it's, it seems to be in, but there's going to come a point where there's going to be pushback on it. And particularly for you as an ally, begin to reach out to your managers and say, hey, ask them frank question. Hey, what are we doing about racism? And what are some anti-racist policies that I could see in practice, not in theory, because you have theory and then you have culture. How is this played out in my workplace? And how can we address it? And I ain't going nowhere until we begin to put steps into place for that. It's really begin to be courageous and step out of our comfort zone and step out of the place where we diffuse responsibility and begin to say, I'm seeing injustice of myself, just like the bystander. I'm not going to watch somebody be taken advantage of and then deflect responsibility because somebody else is standing beside me. Don't look to your co-workers. You take the responsibility. In your family, you take the responsibility to be to have courageous conversation, to be to push forth this cause. And then I'm looking at Andrew has us on strict time. And the last one I'd say is this: representation. When you work with the Black community, we've been through a lot of trauma as it relates to race. And I've been the one that has been speaking about the room in terms of mental health. It is vitally important for us to find health professions, therapists, social workers, clinicians that are from our background. It does not mean that anybody else is going to lose their job. I remember when I was first working for a Black agency, I went into the justice field, everybody became so anxious. Oh my God, they're going to take out our clients. The concern was not, okay, maybe they'll do some good work. It's like, they're going to take out our clients. No, that's not the case. But at certain times, there are some benefits when a young man, a young woman, an older man, older woman go and look for a clinician that looks like them and have some insight in terms of what the real impact of racism is. It is a massive tool to healing. And, so there's community health services like Kaibu. I'm gonna send some resources and people's name that you could tap into. But for those of you that are in the justice sector field that has worked with individuals, we have a responsibility to also link them to clinicians that are from their community that could help them work with these things, not just psychologically, but some of the trauma, the historical trauma that has occurred as a result of racism. So those are the three I'm going to put forth. I'm actually going to chime in back when the other panelists speak. But remember, don't fight on behalf, fight with. We're not looking for heroes. We're looking for someone to stand beside us and allow us to push forward some things. We're looking for someone to kind of walk alongside us. We want to still have our voice in the cause because sometimes when you have a platform, you can inadvertently quench the voice of someone because allies are in a position that we're not. Your privilege has put you in a position, and if you're not sensitive to how to advocate, you could actually use that position and do more harm by suffocating the voice of those you're fighting on behalf of. And be courageous. This is the time for us to be courageous and push this conversation forward in whatever sphere that we're in. So I'll stop there, Derek, and I'll allow everyone else to chime in.
I got to tell you, Tazio hit it right on the head. I was really mesmerized when my brother was speaking, and what he mentioned around, the importance of having professionals be reflective of the client base or the clientele. It really resonated with me. And I'll tell you a quick little story, back when I was released from custody, when I was a young man, and I was put on 3 years of counseling, along with other conditions and what have you. And the judge at the time, it was a judge that mentioned or wanted me to be referred to a culturally relevant organization where, like, my family background is from St. Vincent, and we didn't necessarily have Vincentian type based organizations in the community. But where they did send me to was a Jamaican Canadian Association, which was culturally relevant to me and where I was coming from. So I spent 3 years with a counselor over there by the name of Horace Wright, who was not only my counselor, but also acted like a mentor. So this was a man that looked like me, that spoke like me, that ate the same food like me. And then through that relationship, I was also introduced to another mentor of mine back in the early 90s, God rest his soul, Mr. Dudley Law, that also spent some time with me and provided mentorship. And it was through that experience that introduced me to working with young people and and that type of work, and just, and also healing my community, whether it be Jane and Finch or my community abroad, and it's really critical that when we have young people who are facing these challenges, that we match them with mentorship programs, with professionals, or whoever it is that we provide these supports, or we wrap around these supports around them, that they are reflective of their community, their culture, and that sort of thing, because it also leads to buy-in, from that young person. So yeah, I think Tazio hit it right on the head.
Andrew, you and I have kind of talked about this as well, and we've worked together for many, many, many years in this field. And because obviously, I certainly agree and affirm exactly what you said, you and Tazio. And at the same time, we also know that there have been some really great counselors and workers in our field that don't represent the Black community, and yet they've come with such authenticity and such a desire that they've also had a wonderful, powerful impact. So I certainly want to encourage those watching as well to not feel that in order for a Black kid to get help, they must be paired with a Black counselor, right? As Tazio says, there are certain advantages, and we can connect with community and cultural appropriateness and many benefits to that. But don't think that because you're not from the community, that you don't have a powerful voice and can really create change.
Could I just?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tazio.
I was just going to jump in real quick. There's a facility that I used to have a lot of clients in. It was predominantly white, and I remember there's this one female, to your point, Derek, one woman that was white, but every young man gravitated to her because, number one, she was sensitive about racism, and she was sensitive about her identity. She brought in books that speak to who they are, and based on how she practiced, it never belittled their identity. It literally gravitated to her. So to your point, that you don't have to be in our community to do great work, but you have to be sensitive to some of the issues that impact your clientele.
That's right.
And one of the words that we always tend to use, Derek, for years, we've been using this word, is just to be genuine. Yeah. Be genuine to the work that it is you're doing. Because, for example, I work with predominantly, Black, Indigenous, racialized youth throughout the province and country. And I mean, there's times where, these young people are transferred to facilities that have predominantly white staff there. And I remember, traveling up north to a facility, and one of my young men from the Toronto area was up there, and he made a connection with a staff member that was great up there. And it wasn't about, this staff person trying to put on a front of, of a city slicker or someone he's not, to try to build rapport with this young person, but he brought him outside and he started teaching him about the stars, the solar system, because up north, you could see it a whole lot more clearer. And the relationship that they were able to establish, and it had nothing to do with Black or white. It was this, this staff member that was genuine with this young person and provided him with information that he would to any other kid that was up north, So it's a good point that you raised that. That's right. At the end of the day, obviously there's some big advantages to having that, those commonalities when it comes to culture, but also a lot of it really has to do with being genuine to the work, And
Andrew, I saw Ucha, I saw you try to jump in. So I want to kind of give you the last thought on this particular kind of room, as we've been discussing these rooms over the past 2 webinars. And then from there, maybe you can just give us your recommendations and reflections as it relates to food security.
Yeah, again, I took everything. It took it all, Tazio, when it comes to the ally side. I think, it's really up. I had a colleague who'd always say, it's about hands across, not hands up, like there's a mentality when a lot of people approach this work, and you talk about being genuine, but I think even more so, you got to be coming from a place of knowing yourself, and understanding divine purpose, as someone, like, what are you really here? What are we really here collectively to do? And, some folks will think that they're genuine because they've conditioned themselves to think, I go out, I donate, I give, I attend, I put this somebody through college and so, all of these different things. But if they're not doing the work to unseed and to kind of tear out those weeded conditionings that sometimes are just almost like osmosis from your family upbringing, from your community upbringing, you still have a lot of work to do. So I think on that, to wrap that up, when we're looking at the allies or folks who want to stand with Black community, it is standing with and knowing when to step back too, right? Like a lot of times your main goal is to provide, to use your position to support in whatever way that you can. We talked about, someone being that internal person that was always keeping the racialized staff abreast of what was happening behind the closed doors, because we know there are closed doors where things happen that even the janitor may be privy to, that we are not privy to in our management and all of these roles, right? So, to be a true ally, it's having that courage to genuinely, and not want to be the hero in that you are anointed for that, but being able to step back and, not always have the light shone on your win at the time. I think in terms of food security and even to touch on all of these aspects, I think for me, I really want to talk to the parents, youth, professionals in the various fields, be it social or private or public sector. I think it's very, very, very important to understand your position. Like, understand if it's, parents dealing with, when we're looking at food security in itself, understand the impacts of food on your wellness, on your, the impacts of sugar on your children. Understand when, how your diet contributes to your mental wellness, to your overall, physical wellness, your overall stability as an individual. A lot of times we will fight and we will advocate for so many other things, but when it comes to food, we just accept whatever. Like even when I've seen, and it's a universal issue in that, yes, it's those who are economically impacted suffer the most injustice around food access, but there are people who have the resources, but not the education or not the knowledge of self, or even the knowledge of the impact of foods that they eat and that they consume and how they impact them. I want to encourage, especially all of our youth that may be watching, to get involved in some type of growing. It's a healing, it's a healing experience to put a seed in the ground or into earth, even on a cup on your windowsill, and then to watch it grow from a hard, almost rock-like, solid into this fluid and this life-bearing thing. It's such a magnificent experience, and it has so much deep impact. And you'll see that through even having your hands in soil and from observing growing at the different stages, you'll start to reflect that in your own person and how you're evolving and how you're growing. I think it's very important for speaking to, in particular, the African Canadian community. It's important to understand your culture and your place in agriculture. We live in a country that when you look at the farmer and you look at farms as we see them in agriculture, we think of, Bob, the farmer, big farm hat, blonde hair, blue jeans, and everything. Like this concept that would probably have popped into your mind because we go to, Chudley's, we go to Pringles, we go to all these different farms, and that's who we see. But I think it's very important for parents. I think it's very important for families to understand their place in terms of being the fathers and mothers of agriculture. A lot of the foods that we eat here were actually brought in the seeds were brought in the corn rows of the women who were enslaved, right? So a lot of the rices that are grown in North America, the greens, you wonder, they call amaranth, they call it pigweed, but it's callaloo, and it's not indigenous to this country, but across North America, it grows everywhere. And if you start researching your history in terms of who you're, where our people as African people are historical pre-slavery, where you've come from in terms of agriculture. Even today, there's a big conversation being had about migrant workers. And if you look at the migrant worker, those of us who have family that come over as migrant worker, we know that I have 2 farms that are in my neighborhood, and they're Jamaican farmers, right? You'd never see them on the cover of Quaker's Oats or Cavendish or any of the the companies that your eggs that you get at the Costco and so on and so forth. But the laborers who are doing these work are racialized people, and a majority of them are people from our community. And even to this day, if you look at the terms under which they come to this country to do work, they are really comparable to enslavement, right? So you really have to look at, understand your position. And when I say your position, understand who you are individually as just a magnificent being, and then understand where and how the world perceives you based on this social construct of racism in order for you to successfully navigate where you need to be. Because if you don't understand your history, there's a Sankofa effect, what we call it. If you haven't looked back to fetch your culture, it's very challenging for you to go forward. So you really have to understand that from all dynamics, and especially in the food system. In Canada, our community has the highest rates of diabetes, food-related illness, period. You will find that the African Canadian and Indigenous communities are the most impacted. And this means that they are illnesses that can be controlled based on your diet. So what I would suggest, because of time, research just putting in those food-related diseases Canada, you will find tons of statistics showing you, the challenges that we have as a community. That's and there's so many, yeah.
Andrew, I want to transition over to you next, and kind of we talk about criminal justice and incarceration and kind of the rooms that you've been speaking into for the past 2 weeks, and just want to hear your recommendations and reflections.
Well, similar to Ucha, it's something that I also want to speak to the young people and to the parents, because the truth is that the vast majority of the young people incarcerated in our facilities are, Black youth, Indigenous youth, racialized young people. So, with regards to recommendations, I've been doing this work for a long time, been doing it for about 22, 23 years now. And I've always worked with those young people who I like to call the best of the best, but they're the young people who, are having, a hard time trying to navigate things, and, that may face multiple barriers, and even going back in the day, working with gang involved youth and what have you. So what it all comes down to is, again, just working with them through a cultural lens. And what I mean by that is, again, with regards to supports that you put in place for them, it's not only about supporting the young people, it's about also supporting the family. There's that guy there, and forgive me if I forget his name, Maslow. He does the whole hierarchy of needs and that sort of thing. So that's something I often think about when I think about young people, is that we also have to address their hierarchy of needs, which is basically the same thing when we talk about love, shelter, food and all those things, right? So, and this also applies to the family. So what I find most effective when working with young people is to implement a wraparound approach when working with them, which includes things like, education support. It includes mentorship. It includes healthcare. It includes housing, all sorts of different things. But you also gotta work with the families. When things were I found myself being most effective when working with young people is when, we would do things like sit down at dinner tables with families and have meals with them and turn off the TV and have those type of conversations with not only the young people, but with their parents or whoever was at that table. And at that point, that's when a lot of guards are being removed, they're being taken down. And then, you're able to establish a rapport, that you can challenge that young person to be a better person, and I always found that to be one of the most effective tools when I did my work. And it's just, at the end of the day, I'm a pretty spiritual guy, and I strongly believe it's God's work that we're doing, and I try to do my work with that focus, and also just to listen to the young people. And one of the things I realized over the years is it's a shame, but young people don't dream anymore. They don't dream about their future. It's hard for them to even see past 5 years or what have you. It's man, when I do this work and I sit down with a young person, let's say they're 17, 18 years old, and I always ask them this question. I say, imagine you're sitting at a table and it's your 25th birthday. You have a cake in front of you. There's 25 candles. What does life look like? Who's around that table? Who owns the table? Are you working at that time? Do you see children? And they cannot see this. They cannot see this. They'll tell me the same thing over and over. Man, I'm just trying to stay alive. You know what I mean? So
And
these
Andrew,
are the things I often, I feel strongly about, is to help young people dream again. And I think that'll go a long way. And one of the things I also wanted to put out there, sorry, Derek, is
no, it's
before
okay.
I forget, is there's a report that was put together back in 2008. It was written by Dr. Alvin Curling and the Honorable Roy McMurtry. And it's a great report. It's called The Roots of Youth Violence. It was written back in 2008, but it's very relevant to today. There's tons of recommendations. There's tons of data. There's all sorts of information that you can certainly use as a foundational document to develop work and to move forward with the work. So it's just something I wanted to put out there. And it's called the Roots of Youth Violence.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you actually mentioned that report, because it makes me think of our conversation, the fact that this is not a new conversation. It sounds like a big discussion right now in the media is what are the recommendations and how do we move forward, as though no recommendations have already been made over the past, decades that we've been in here. So recommendations are already there. Maybe a question that we'll return to at the end is almost some type of an evaluation is, have some of the recommendations, such as the Roots of Violence report, what was implemented and what were some of the barriers to kind of moving that forward.
Hey, Derek, can I just add one real quick piece too? Is also an important piece to this. It's also investing in cultural specific organizations, Black organizations, whether it be your organizations like the Jamaican Canadian Association, the Tropicanas. And what I mean by that is investment where there are resources to evaluate programs, develop programs where we can then create evidence-based, culturally informed programs for the young people. I think that'll go a long way because, oftentimes a lot of our cultural specific organizations out there are running on empty fuel, on just fumes, and they don't necessarily have the resources to take their programs and services to the next level, or to bring it to a level where it's really, taken seriously. So that's just something I wanted to put out there in terms of recommendation on a macro scale, is really some real investment into organizations.
That's good. Thank you. Ms. Nicole.
Hi, everybody. When I was listening to everyone speak, I thought of like this idea that allyship is really about action, right? And that's, I think, the important piece that everyone's saying in different ways, is that to be an ally, it's not just about talking about it, but it's about, using your privilege, using your position, using your seat at the table to make active, changes or active suggestions. And when I was thinking about in terms of like education, which is what I've been talking about a lot, it's the idea that everybody wants to feel safe, whether it's Black teachers or Black students in the schools. Everybody wants, especially students, want to have like their teachers to have high expectations and positive expectations about who they are. And then also, when I think about it as well, we look at who's at the table. And I say that in terms of who are your leaders in your school in terms of teachers, but specifically who are your leaders in your school when it comes to students as well. Are Black students being supported in having leadership roles within the school, whether it's like a school council or starting a club or something like that. So when I really think about allyship, it's about, making room at the table for Black students and educators to be part of like the decision making process of like your board or your classroom or your school system. So I think for me, that's the first recommendation for allies. I also think that when we're talking about allyship, it's trust the experience of other Black professionals that are in your circle. I know, and I can speak for myself, that sometimes I feel like I will say something that's valid, but it needs to be validated by someone who is not Black, right? And for it to be worthy of listening to. And so it's trust the professionals that sit beside you because they're sitting beside you, right? They're there because they're supposed to be there. They got there just like you. And so I would say to trust their experiences and to trust what they have to say. And I could go on in terms of other recommendations in terms of supporting Black students. But I think the main one, after speaking to students, within this last month or so, what they really want you allies to know is that we belong here and you need to make space for us and you need to make it a safe space for us, whether it's in the hallways, whether it's in our classrooms, whether it's in the office space. They want to be there, but they want it to be a safe space.
That's good.
Yeah, I think that's super powerful because it's understanding too. We had a discussion recently I had with my team just around what safety means. Like, is it, it's beyond your physical safety. It's a space where you're cultivating an awareness and a sense, a sense of awareness and a sense of responsibility to make ensuring that everyone belongs. You know what I mean? So I think that's such an important point.
And I just want to say that I believe that everyone that has signed on to this talk already is a positive step. That's really something positive that you've done, and I want to commend you for that. And I want to throw one last thing out in terms of the power of strategic thinking. The power of strategic thinking. Sometimes getting a recommendation is not as powerful as sitting down and assessing a situation, tapping into some researches, and then thinking strategically in terms of how I could make an investment. There's most of us are spiritual, but there's like a biblical story about a person, the Good Samaritan, that fell ill. He was robbed and beaten up, and someone came and just looked and assessed the situation, said, this man needs shelter, this man needs resources, finances, this one needs medicine, needs food, nutrition, and implemented a plan. So sometimes in terms of just being a great ally, is just really saying the first step is to really think strategic. I'm going to read the Roots of Violence report. I'm going to tap into some community agencies. I'm going to tap into some Black professional, my coworkers, and I'm going to begin to ask some questions. And then with them, begin to think strategically in terms of what is my next step? Because part of the recommendation is that some parts, I guess to be real frank, this part of this is some hard work. We don't want to minimize it, and I don't want the point to come across like this is easy. It really takes a lot of work, and many of us who have been doing it. It means that you got to actually sit down, you got to engage people, you got to think strategically, you're going to ask questions, you're going to have to think of policy practices, and then through that, begin to see what are some practical steps I could take. And I want to emphasize in my sphere, because at the end of the day, we might not ask you to become Justin Trudeau, but at the end of the day, all of us have a sphere of influence. Whether it be in our family, whether it be in our job, everyone that is listening to me right now, there's a sphere where you could influence that could push the cause. And your sphere might not be this big political sphere, but within your sphere, if you should think strategically and tap into resources and do some research, Ucha gave some stuff on nutrition, education, justice, like whatever sphere you're in, there's some information there that can be had. And then sit down and think strategically in terms of what is the issue? What are some of the issues impacting my sphere? And how can I push justice as it pertains to racism in a strategic, effective manner by building allies and by respecting my coworkers or my peers or my friends that have had lived experience and may have something to say.
Tazio raised a really good point earlier too. It's about keeping the conversation going, keeping it going, because even I've been feeling like some of the momentum has decreased, so, and it's really important to keep the conversation going and to encourage people to be anti-racist opposed to non-racist, and to develop ways to embed these things into day-to-day practices and a part of your regular routine. So I think it's a real good starting point in terms of just keeping the conversation going within your circle and beyond.
Nicole?
And sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Nicole?
I was going to say that part of, like, when Tazio said the work is difficult, just to remember that if you're an ally, it's going to get messy sometimes, right? You might lose people that you thought were close to you because it is difficult to talk about, and you are challenging sometimes people's really deep-rooted beliefs about themselves, about their communities, about their own family members. And so part of being that ally is knowing that it may get difficult, and I would say without a doubt it will get difficult. And it's really
about to know you're doing it the right way, right? Like, because
exactly.
It's shaking the comfort, right? Because
That's
and especially in the Canadian narrative is we want to be comfortable with each other, so we make accommodations, we accommodate, a lot of these isms. So
be a disruptor is what one of the administrators that I work with, she said, it's okay to be a disruptor, right?
Yeah, and this is always a challenge, especially because sometimes those that have the loudest voice and the influence and might issue these, as we talked about, microaggressions and racial comments, they have such a persona about themselves that it's really hard to check these people, right? There's almost like an intimidation thing. I think I think back to the first webinar when we were sharing our personal stories, and for myself, it was for my family, on my mother's side, on that white side. The one person in particular who was extremely overtly racist, he had such a strong personality that it was just hard to take Tazio's recommendation of being courageous, when you're like that. And so sometimes you can feel shut out and silent. And so to think about that as well. But at the end of the day, if nothing happens, nothing happens, right? It becomes the bystander effect. Like Tazio said, nobody ends up doing anything, but yet somebody gets trampled on. And we've talked about the devastating effect of systemic racism over the past 3 weeks that it has on our Black community. This is not an issue that can't be just skirted around because we just lack that, I don't know, not just willingness or desire, but just to kind of get in the trenches and help. Like, it has devastating effects. We've all, for many years, been working in this field, and we've all spoken at so many funerals and attended so many funerals of young Black men over the years. Like, when you're out on the street because of suspension and expulsion, out of school because of suspension and expulsion, like I think 36% of our Black students will be, we're doing something, we're on the streets. When we can't access mental health, we're on the streets. And like Tazio said in the second webinar, is mental health, the behavior itself is characterized as just aggressive, or we label the behavior instead of the mental health in the Black community. And I think obviously for working in the prisons with young men that can't get released because of can't meet bail conditions, they can't get those bail conditions together. They're missing school, then they're missing employment opportunities, their education gap widens, and then they come out and they've got mental health and they've got this trauma and they've got no resources. So where do you go? You got to make a quick dollar. You're back on the street. Where does it end? Now, again, here we are talking about funerals and weeping with parents and trying to help people.
Yeah.
I think something I really want to suggest to our families, especially parents and young adults watching, really watch the cycles. Like if you look at, when I say look back at your culture, look back at your culture in context of all of these houses, like really explore, because you'll see this is cyclical. Like the roots of violence, this time that we're going through now almost feels very similar. There was, the year of the gun, and this was a major event, and then we dove into giving, like right now all of these resources are coming out, capital funding for Black infrastructure, capital, a new emerging Black commerce vehicle, all of these things, but they ebb and flow, and we're only successful if we are able to bring up a standard and maintain it, right? And the only way that we're able to do that is if we recognize the cycle and we break the pattern, right? Like you cannot just be happy with financial resources. That's not the end all to be all. There's a lot of work that we as Black community have to do in healing ourselves that does not involve any other community, but as a Black community, us coming together and doing our work. And then there's work that other communities need to do within their communities to understand how to be allies, right?
So then, Ucha,
but this
let me then stop you and pose this first question. I'm looking at the time, so we promised a hard stop.
I know your hard stop.
I would like to thank all of you once again for sharing those recommendations. And I do want to start with questions that have already come in. And the first one really ties in, Ucha, with what you're now talking about. And that is, what are the first steps do people need to take in order to help themselves? So this sounds like we're looking at ourselves.
I think I think we all have a quiet place when we're alone, where we're true with ourselves. If you're mentally well, some people aren't mentally well and they're not able to get to that, that base point. But, I think initially it starts with you. Change starts from within. Michael Jackson had the song, The Man in the Mirror, and that was talking about starting change with yourself.
Yeah.
So you can't run out there trying to save, and I'm speaking to anyone in any of the so-called races, you cannot go out there and do the work that needs to be done without having, sitting down and cultivating some type of truism within yourself, understanding your truths, understanding the truth of your culture, understanding the impacts of your truth, your cultural truths on the major majority, on the majority, right? It begins there, and others can share, where that goes on as well.
I think Ucha hit it. I think she hit it when it's one of those things you got to discover your own epiphany, and one of the things too is help facilitate that change within yourself, and try not to let tragedy facilitate that change, and what I mean by that is the amount of young people that's come to us in the years and say, I want to change my life. My friend just got killed. Try to make those changes before the friend gets killed. Try to bring that change within yourself, and then from there, I think that's a good first step.
Yeah, I want also say that when you want to be true to yourself, first and foremost, you have to be willing to face the uncomfortable aspect of yourself, which most time people shy away from in terms of, and I want to tap back into Ucha's point that sometimes we got to look at ourselves, not only within our present context, but also within our historical context. Like, what does a complete me look like, both present and both historical? And we have to face sometimes those uncomfortable aspects of ourselves. We can't shy away from it because we might see something we don't like, or there might be some biases that come to the surface when we think about certain things. Like certain conversation triggers people. So you just need to ask, why did I get so emotional when I heard this? And why did I get so triggered when this person said this statement? And I really begin to look into it. And when I saw this image on the TV, why did I think this way? And why did these thoughts come in my head? I got to be willing to kind of face those dynamics, those aspects of ourselves, particularly when we get to be aroused by certain things, certain statements, certain issues. That's revealing something about your identity.
Yeah, pretty much a vicarious trauma too, right?
Yeah, and I would suggest that perhaps Derek can post in the communications moving. I'm not sure how that end works, but there's a lot of great thought tanks and institutions that are doing dismantling work that on an individual basis. Like I know Youth Rex out of York was doing a lot of anti-oppression work with Nani Kafele that was, super powerful, really sitting down, having conversations amongst, I got to experience one at my work with the YOWs, so the youth outreach workers in the East Quadrant, and they were sitting down and exploring, most of them are racialized youth or professionals, but they are working under the context of this governance of predominantly white, management structure. So it was bringing all of them to the table. And it's interesting, it's done over a couple of days, and you start to notice after the third day who leaves the room, right? Like the people who can choose not to come, right? All of a sudden have emergency things that come up because the conversations are challenging. But I'll encourage you, you can't go through one DR training, dismantling racism, you can't go through one anti-oppression. It's an ongoing process. If you look at the time that from in the womb, we've been shaped with certain biases. So when you look at that from that, a time lens, it takes that, that equally and maybe even more amount of time to consistently hold yourself accountable. In the Kemetic tradition, they have like the weighing of the hearts, and they talk about, every day you weigh yourselves against the laws of God, not just at the crossroads or at the end of your life, or every day you take accountability for your actions. Did I transgress against my neighbor? Did I lie on somebody? Did I, so it's holding that level of accountability based on your truth daily and reflecting on how you've either progressed, a narrative for the group that you're attempting to support, or how you've transgressed against that, in even sometimes just in your thought. We haven't even touched on that, but the power of your thoughts, right? And so, it's very important to be able to take that assessment. And if you can't do it yourself, there's a lot of institutions here in Toronto that are doing a lot of profound work around helping individuals and organizations walk through these difficult conversations that are necessary. Yeah.
And that was kind of, Nicole.
Sorry. I was just gonna to add that it's great. I agree wholeheartedly with what all the other speakers are saying about doing that personal inventory. But I think it's also adding, once you've done that personal inventory and you identify areas that you need to change or get help with, then it's important for you to reach out to spaces and people and places where you can get that help if you can't work on those things on your own. And especially in our communities where seeking, if it's therapy or some type of mental health, is sometimes looked at as taboo. It's important to know that if you really want to be supportive of yourself, you might have to reach out to those spaces to get that support out there. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's actually, we had talked about maybe 2 weeks ago when we were talking about CEOs and executive directors using those tools, right? And so there's nothing wrong with you, a person of color who's experienced so much trauma, to use those tools to get better, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Andrew, I want to pose this next question to you, and Tazio, we'll start with you, Andrew. How do we begin to dismantle the internalized oppression that often exists within certain systems, such as justice?
Oh man, we'll need another hour for that one there. You know what I mean? But to be honest with you, it's more or less I'll throw something out there. Again, the vast majority of the young people who I've worked with my entire life are Black youth, Indigenous youth, and other racialized youth. And I tell you, 95%, and these are just my own numbers over the years, 95% of them would be doing something different if they had the opportunity, and I'll be quite honest, I'm a realist. I just tell it how it is, there is 5% of them out there. All we can do for them is just one of these, because they are highly committed to the lifestyle. You know what I mean? But I'll be honest, 95% of them would do something different if they had the options. So how can we create those options? How can we help the young people, again, feel safe in those spaces, in those places, and introduce them to, introduce them to new experiences? For example, another thing is to, help them think outside of the box. And what I mean by that is when young people are caught up in these street dynamics, these street politics that exist out there, they make their world a whole lot smaller. And let's be honest, these politics exist within our communities, our marginalized communities out there. So they make their world a whole lot smaller to the point where they can't even experience things out there. For example, I'll ask a young person, have you ever gone to Ripley's Aquarium? And they'll look at me and tell me, yo, are you mad? I can't go out there, what have you. So how can we help young people open up their eyes to new experience? That's something I strongly believe in, but again, it's a process. It's a process to get them to that place. So it's a tough one because the system's not built for us. You know what I mean? And yet, the vast majority of the young people in the system are, as I mentioned, Black, Indigenous, other racialized young people. So how can we help them, one, navigate through the system, but also provide them with the support where they'll be able to sustain, their newfound trajectory.
Tazio, to you. It's good. So again, how do we begin to dismantle the internalized oppression that often exists within these systems, within these institutions, for example, justice?
Yeah, I think I'm going to speak to maybe on the macro and the micro scale. Number one, it's understanding there's this principle in justice that we understand, but I don't believe apply well to Black males, proven innocent until proven guilty. That when you watch media, we have this perception when somebody's been arrested, a young Black man is being killed, that this person has not gone through the court process. This could be a regular citizen like me and you, and the way the justice system functions, like stats show that we're less likely to get bail. You're supposed to stats, Derek, less likely to be held in the detention, not released by the detention. And what's that saying? That is the fundamental principle of justice that's held up in the justice system as it relates to Black male. You're not proven innocent. You're not innocent until proven guilty. You're guilty, and you must prove your innocence. That's how it functions for Black males. So, from a system standpoint, we need to first recognize that the way justice is operating is that it operates when you're guilty and you must prove yourself innocent. And what happens psychologically, it begins to take root in the young men that we work with, where they see themselves as this, they're portrayed so much, and most of the time it begins within the school setting, the safe school setting, of that they're portrayed as such criminals that they begin to take on these images onto themselves and begin to make it almost like a stripe. And what I do for them is to kind of show them, okay, here's a big game. And here's you as a pawn in this game. And do you want to remain a pawn? Like I also say, okay, for example, you're making this much money. Who do you think is at the top of the chain in the criminal? Whoever's at the top of the chain don't look like you, and they're not getting caught. You're not being raided. When they go raid the neighborhoods, and the poor grandmothers put out there. I mean, I had this story that grandmothers held out in the rain and just handcuffed. I'm saying it's not the guys that are bringing on the drugs, them, and the weapons that are being raided and put on TV. It's the low class guys. So it's to let them understand that there's a system that is really playing on their minds, a system that says this group of people at all times will see them as guilty and they need to prove their innocence while everyone else is innocent, and the system bears the burden of proving them guilty. So number one, that's the first thing that we need to recognize as a society, that the fundamental principle of justice is not adhered to when it comes to Black males particularly, where the burden of proof is now shifted on a community, saying that when we go to arrest you, we're seen as a criminal. Look at what took place, like this young man that got his eye. We're seen in a certain way, and we're going to enact justice at the beginning of the stage before you get to court and see a judge. And then for our young brothers is to say, listen, here's the system that you're part of. And here's how, for example, I look at Regent Park. I said to my young brothers, I said, listen, many guys died repping the block. Well, these guys came and put condos there and kicked you out of the block. It was never yours in the beginning. How much brothers has died for Regent Park? How much brothers died on behalf of Regent Park that right now they just got kicked out of, and just like that, through the gentrification process. So it's really let them understand the bigger picture, because a lot of time when they work, they see this in a small scale, but when they begin to understand, okay, you're just a pawn, and you got to step out of this game if you have any chance of being successful, because you're just being utilized by a system. You're being utilized, in a crude way. So it's really, you can't address the internalized oppression unless you really speak to the injustice of the system. Because when you work with these young men, if you're telling them to change, but you don't speak to the issues of the system, it's hard for them to kind of hear you. So I will start to say, hey, the system is wrong. Like, all you guys are guilty before you even see a judge. That's a fundamental flaw in justice. And then you must recognize.
Is there a way, Tazio, that we can begin to change the system? Because I think this is a part of the question too, is it's like, what can we do about the system itself?
Well, number one, I think all of us, back to my point, all of us have to take responsibility. Sometimes just go to court and begin to speak to the duty council. Here's some practical thing. Every court has a supervisor duty council. They're representative. They're there for representing, the accused, what have you. When you begin to ask people certain questions, it begins to shed light on practices. Just by going to the court, how are you guys representing young Black men? Because I see that there's a pattern taking place. If that's true, and if imagine the volume of people going into court and start asking lawyers, how are you representing Black folks? Just random, they might not answer you. But the fact that this is 10 individuals that ask me this question is like, okay, what's going on? It's like we got to hold people consciously by beginning to question their practices. Because let's think about the big scale. And I believe in like writing your politician. Those are some things you could do. But also walking into court and start asking some courageous questions like, hey, here's some stats. How are you guys addressing this? You're being paid to present that. Some mothers out there, you've had your children, you may have had your children go through court. And what happens? You feel so overwhelmed. You have the right to start asking these lawyers some real frank questions like, how are you presenting and taking into consideration the racial system? How is race, anti-racism a part of your practice as a lawyer? So that's professionals that are working alongside youth, that's for parents and community. We got to start asking people these tough questions in terms of how does anti-racism plays out in a justice system, because that's what I'm doing, with my platform.
And you know what, Derek?
Sorry, Andrew, I see Nicole, and then I want to move on to the next question.
Sorry.
I think what Tazio is talking about is this idea of using your individual voice, but then also looking at the collective voice, right? And so it's, when the group of individuals come together and collectively demand and ask questions, then we can really start to see that systematic change happening within all of our institutions that we work in, right? So I think it's important for parents and youth and other advocates to understand the power that you have in your voice by just being present and asking any question, all questions.
And that's why the understanding your position. Remember, I said initially, if you don't understand just the context in which you live in, it's difficult to even know what questions to ask. So it's very important to do that.
And Derek, the one that I was gonna add real quick is to really look into the possibility around community-based restorative justice.
That's right.
where we stop decriminalize, or we stop criminalizing young people and bring them through a process that is community-based and accountable to the community. Similar in the indigenous world is that there are there are community-based circles or restorative justice circles where these type of things are dealt with. So I think that's a good way for us to start, is to start looking into these different processes that will not further criminalize or introduce young people to the criminal justice system.
I know you're just quickly mention, it's funny that it's interesting, I should say, not even funny, that you've mentioned restorative justice. So with my time, I've always been an advocate for restorative justice. And with our youth work in my professional life, every single application we've put in, maybe 6, I think we're working on a 7th right now, around restorative justice has been never approved. When for funding. Never approved. And I mean, like, we have strong, academic position, we have strong community relationship, we have all of the professionals there to really lead the charge. And it's always there's only so much funding. And then when you see what's funded, it's the textbook guns and gangs, like this whole narrative around, so I think, I even had a funder say to me, like, why don't it's brilliant what you're trying to do, but why don't you just use different language? Well, why don't you use the guns and gangs language, but then do the restorative justice when you get the reason, So again, that is the internalized oppression and institution, right? Like, that's how it manifests itself, is that even, you know, when I know for myself as a Black woman leader in my you know, in my sector, it's that always, if I don't have the ally on the other side that understands the concept, even when they're at the table advocating for it, because the collective is almost afraid of Black community-based solution, right? Like there is always, and it's not just here. I've seen it, you know, at JCA. I've seen it at Tropicana. I've seen it at Taibu. Anytime, you know, often you have to fight so hard for just scraps for the around the resources to do this work. And then when they do grant you, they put all of these conditions that are not culturally focused. And so it's like, how do you expect me to do this culturally based work that requires us to have some flexibilities around ABC? And you're tying up my finger, you know, you're tying me and binding me to something that is just not written or designed for this community, right?
Andrew,
and so,
sorry, no, my apologies. Finish your point.
No. So I just want to make it clear that, you know, we say that these are the solutions, but also the oppression is in a lot of these funding bodies and a lot of these hierarchical structures that decide what's going to go forth and what's not going to go forth, you know, and we have to be very aware of that and advocate against it as well.
Richard, that's such an important point, and I'd be really interested to find out why restorative justice isn't being approved on such a mass scale. But I'm wondering if everybody, we kind of using that term, but I'm not sure everyone knows what that is. Andrew, I was hoping maybe in 1 minute, you could do two things. Literally in 60 seconds, could you do two things? Really quickly define restorative justice. And secondly, within the context of education. So we've talked about before, and we mentioned in stats that 36% of, I think that was a 2016-2017 TDSB statistic, that all that Black high school youth were either suspended or expelled. Which means that the problem is that now that they're out of school even more. These students were probably already having trouble in school, and now we've suspended them or expelled them. So now you increase the learning gap, increase their time being away from school. So instead of that, as an alternative to suspension, expulsion, restorative justice, maybe Andrew.
Yeah, restorative justice, and real quick is, you know, it's more or less to take the process out of the hands of the court and to bring it back to the community, where you have two parties or whatever happened, and then they're able to come together through a process where it's the conflict is then mediated and common ground is found where both parties kind of agree to it or what have you. That's kind of it in a nutshell. And the reason why there's challenges when it comes to funding restorative justice practices or programs or what have you is that it's funny, over the last, I'd say 15 years or so, restorative justice has been this thing that's gone through peaks and valleys, like almost like a flavor of the month type thing. So when it's a buzzword out there, there's a lot of talk around it. And then people will then try to, you know, apply or, you know, try to develop these restorative justice processes, but and usually they're not successful. And then it kind of goes away and then it comes back up. But we need to kind of really lead this thing and try to bring those processes back to the community, you know. And it's not just something where, you know, there's, you know, a person in the community that says, okay, you come here and you come here and let's shake hands and walk away. There's an actual process, and it is accountable to the court system or what have you, where, you know, at the end of the day, though, the outcomes have to be provided and submitted to the court to sign off. But then you're taking it out of the hands of the court, in the hands of the community, where you could then apply those cultural specifics to it or different things like that.
Thank you, Andrew, for that. Does anyone else want to chime in? Or actually, I'd like to move on to another question, but that's really important. The next question is coming back to the conversation on allyship. So how do we start getting people to understand the importance of allyship, and then particularly avoiding some type of power and control tactics that can re-traumatize so many youth?
Uche not jumping in.
Yeah, I originally was asking Uche for this.
I mean, it's such a unpack. There's so many moving parts. But I'll let you.
So yeah, again, so the idea is allyship. The idea is misuse of allyship, and that you could end up using power and control, maybe perhaps unintentionally, and it can become well, they call it a tactic, but it could be conceived as power control that can re-victimize or re-traumatize youth.
I'll give one point and then I'll let everyone jump in. First principle is this: anytime an ally comes to support and they don't come from I want to learn perspective, want to learn from you, you already have created a dynamic of power. You're pretty much perpetrating the system. Anytime an ally says, like, I want to help you, but they don't come from like, I want to learn about what's going on and learn how to kind of best help you, that is the first hint that you're going to create this dynamic of power, and you're going to almost perpetrate the very system that you're trying to help with. So I'll just give that one nugget, that anytime you try to be an ally, you must always come from, I'm willing to learn and be informed by those I'm trying to support.
Yeah.
I think, oh, go ahead. Okay, go ahead.
I was just wanted to add, like, in this whole work around like anti-racist work, or it's not perfect, right? Like, no one is asking for your perfection all the time. And I think that part of being an ally, when you recognize that, hey, you know what, I am taking over the conversation a bit. I might be, traumatizing the people that I'm working with, then it's okay to be able to say, I'm sorry, right? Like, I made a mistake. I'm going to try this again, right? Because if we're in a space where you're afraid to try to be an ally, because out of fear of like offending or, doing something wrong, then nothing gets done, right? And so I think it's important to know that, hey, in this work, it's okay to make a mistake, but the most important part is like being able to recognize when you're either called out for it and just pivot and be able to move and be accountable and learn, like what Tazio said.
I strongly feel that it's at that point where that humility comes in around wanting to learn and understand rather than lead. Something popped up when you were speaking, Tazio. I remember years ago, I was involved with a youth organization, and one of my colleagues, Caucasian young woman, came from Peterborough. She did her studies in school in international business. So she used this as this wand of authority or right to work in Black community, because she did a course, and had a degree in international business. And it was just beyond me the first time that she mentioned, I had said something about, it's very important to have representation from the community. And she took offense, that, well, I have a degree in international business. So, I studied all cultures. I lived in the Yukon for a bit. I did work in Botswana. And you have to understand, again, you're doing that from your position of power and privilege. You're not doing that from a position of allyship. And allyship, an important part of being an ally is knowing when to step up and how to step up. And that's learning from the community that you're supporting how to do so in a way that's appropriate. And most importantly, when to step back. A lot of times we see a lot of our brothers and sisters victim to, I have a sister that just passed away recently, that was working for an institution that she was the heart and soul of that institution. She wrote all the grants, she knew all the clients, and you have this boss above her that thinks she's an ally, but it's actually almost like a succubus, sucking the energy and life out of the individual, which happens to a lot of people, because allyship is not just a framework or a tactic. It's a whole decolonization of yourself, colonization of what you've been taught, and then sitting at the feet of those whom you're looking to support, to be kind of re-educated in their way and their understanding, not so that you can assimilate the culture, but that you can understand with more meaning and be more helpful in a way that is going to actually help and not harm. So that's my contribution to that piece. There is, allyship is, sometimes I don't even like the word ally. Like, I just find that we always have to almost we have to package and parcel everything so that it makes sense, you know. Two, it's not even for us, it's for a culture that wants to make sense of it, right? Like we would have never came up with as a Black culture ally because we don't even perceive relationships culturally in that way, right? So, you know, so it's another piece of this social structure that's almost be pushed on us. And you know, like we talked about earlier, sorry, Derek, I have to throw it out there, but this whole concept of the always being asked as Black. I've been on so many panels over this last couple of weeks of COVID and all these different things, and it's interesting. People always come with, you know, so you know, how do you? What would be your suggestion to the violence? If you were Justin Trudeau, what would you do? You know, like, and it's like, what would you do if this was your child? You know what I mean? How would you feel if this was your daughter out there being sexually trafficked amounts of, you know, up and down the place? How would you deal with that? You know what I mean?
Sorry,
It's yeah.
Yeah, no, I just really want to jump on that point and jump off. I think we don't understand the power of just being a human being, humanity. Just like what you said, like if this was to happen to me or my son and my daughter,
that's right.
You think that my behavior would be so much different than someone that is Black? I think we need to understand that really it's just we're just really appealing to the human heart, the human soul, to say that, okay, if this happened to me, there's certain the behaviors probably won't be that much different. And just putting yourself empathy, just putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, and really the solutions may not be that much different than what we've come up with. So back to your point that sometimes it's just really saying, as a human being, if I also experience this, what are some things I'd want for myself or for my community? What are some things I'd want to change? And that alone is just going to generate a lot of answers.
And you have to look at historically, like what are the action items? Like even we look at the cocaine to crack, you know, 80s, early 90s plague it's south of the border. It was only when white children started taking crack, when white children started taking drugs, and it was coming home to suburban communities where this was this huge upheaval and just say no to drugs and all of this new policy restructure and this whole new reform. You know, do we wait until that happens, or are we looking at our and we're really brothers and sisters, you know, outside of this social construct? Are we looking at our Black brother as a Caucasian person and seeing them as we see our family in our household? You know, are they the other? You know, there's a whole paradigm of the othership, right? And dealing with the other and so on and so forth. And are we really seeing each other as we see, you know, as we see ourselves? Really, you know, do we see each other as we see ourselves? And I think that's the number one thing that you can hold yourself accountable every day, is to really reflect on your actions and how you would ingest, or how you would process, or how would you perceive your actions towards somebody if you were standing in their shoes. You know, it very important. It's a lot of work. It's not just attending a class or doing a nice thing for a Black child. Like I spoke at a school years ago, and on the off of the Danforth. It's one of the, you know, one of these the TDSB tech schools, and they got they got everything there. And these children, they're sons and daughters of doctors and lawyers. And this child gets up and he says to me, "Well, I've helped your people." And this wasn't even a racialized conversation at all. He said, "I've helped your people because I've gone to Africa with my dad to make wells. So I've done my part." And it was like talking about doing your part to help the environment and so on and so forth. But this little child, you know, had again that sense of privilege that he could talk to me as a grown adult. We would never, you know, even consider doing that. But he was no more than maybe 11 years old, and he stepped to me and said, "I've helped your people, like, you know, because I've gone to Africa with my dad and we did wells last summer as to do my part," you know. So there are so many issues with that, and to him, he's living in a world where that's accepted and that's nurtured and that's celebrated because, you know, you're doing a good thing. But what is the context? You know, what is the context? What are the shaping factors on how you even arrive to help Black community? That's another piece too, right? So,
and you know, just as I'm listening to this too, and it's true, you know, when Uche was mentioning about the young man there that said, I help your people and what have you. And I tell you, like, this thing will never go away. It's gonna, I think on earlier session that I mentioned, it's like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was here before us. It'll be here after us. You know, when we talk about allyship, I think there's different levels of allies. You know, and I think it's important that potential allies do a couple of things. That was pretty much mentioned earlier. It's more or less to check yourself, know your role, and humble yourself. You know, and then once you figure out what your role is in all of this, and you know why you're doing it, but also to understand that this is not necessarily only your fight. This is not your fight. It's our fight, you know, and as you kind of assist in whatever way you can. And I tell you, and the levels of allyship, it could be something, you know, just as calling someone out, you know, it could be within your own family. And if somebody says something at the dinner table, you call them out. It's those little things, you know, that can certainly go a long way. And again, it's something that's not going to vanish completely. But I mean, at the same time, if we can encourage people to open their eyes and realize what's going on and realize what's been happening for so many years, I think that's a good little start towards a place of allyship.
I want to end with one last comment that that we received. It says says people would like more sessions, and in particular more sessions addressing different pillars of society and how we could restructure them.
Daytime sessions.
So, yeah. So
well, Derek, another thing. I am down. You know, I'm more than happy to do it. And another thing, maybe if there's a way that you could provide information, like if anybody has any questions, you know, towards me that, you know, they'd like to ask, they could certainly reach me at andrewbackus@rogers.com. You know, shoot me an email, and certainly I'll do my best to answer your questions, or to also provide whatever assistance I can. If people need assistance around making a referral to an organization or wanting some information on processes or what have you, I'd be more than happy, you know, to help in whatever way I can.
Tazio, Nicole, Andrew, and Ucha, I am so grateful that you lended your time to this conversation. I found it really fruitful, and the feedback that I've received, even through my personal emails and social media platforms, is that people have learned a lot, and I've just really appreciated this time together. I think hopefully one of the takeaways that people receive from this is in the media is mentioned that this conversation on anti-Black or systemic racism is just really focused on police violence. But hopefully at the end of this conversation, these conversations, that when this topic comes up, you also interject the idea of mental health, of food security, of education, and criminal justice. We have one house with many rooms. Police violence is just one of them. And there are many more that we haven't even explored. So thank you for watching, everyone. I appreciate your feedback and your time and your questions. Have a good night.
Have a good night, everyone.
And thank you, Derek. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek.